So I'm going to share with you about the pea, snap bean, and lima bean trials that I did this past year. So in this picture, you can see the snap bean trial is what is in the middle of the photo. I had lima bean trials on either side of that, and then the lima bean breeding lines are in the far distant back there. So that's some of what I had going on this past summer. And I'm going to start out talking about the snap bean trials. So these trials there were two trials. One was planted on June 9th and harvested end of July, beginning of August. The second one was planted in mid-July and harvested in mid-September. So past several years, I've been doing snap bean trials with the goal of identifying heat tolerant varieties. So the early trial was planted to experience heat stress. Hopefully the timing of planting was going to give us good heat stress on that trial. And the goal of the late trial was that would be an unstressed planting to see what the yields of these varieties look like under unstressed conditions. The issue with snap beans and heat stress is the nighttime temperatures for Phaseolus vulgaris, so dry beans and snap beans or green beans. They know that the critical temperature is around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. This chart is showing the daily maximum and minimum temperatures for July of 2020, which is the flowering when the early planted trial was flowering. That blue dotted line that you should now see on there looks like it moved, but should have been at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It looks like it's scooted down on my slide for some reason. But the important thing to note is that there were only 4 nights in July of this year that were below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And so definitely this trial was exposed to heat stress. Oh, there's my yellow line. Okay, that's the 68 degree Fahrenheit line. Okay, so July 27th, that's when harvest started. The red arrow is indicating the approximate date of full flower for all the varieties. So obviously there's some differences between varieties and when they start flowering or when they're at full flower, but July 13th was about when most of the trial was in full flower. And the flowers are most susceptible to damage from heat stress in the 10 days before they open. So bean flowers open for 1 day and they're done. So that yellow bracket is indicating the 10 days prior to full flower. So that's the susceptible period. And there was 1 night in that period that was less than 68 degrees. So they were certainly exposed to a fair amount of heat stress. The issue, as I've talked about in previous years with heat stress for beans, both lima and snap beans, is that hot nights cause the anthers to be indehiscent or to not open and release the pollen. So in this picture, I'm showing you over here on the left is a microscope image of some anthers that were exposed to heat stress and they did not open and release the pollen. So those little circles inside of the larger structures here are the pollen grains that weren't released from the anthers. These anthers to the right are anthers that have opened up and released. The ones on the left still full of pollen because they didn't open up and release it. The ones on the right released their pollen like they were supposed to. So not so many red circles inside of there. So when the pollen gets released on a bean flower, it gets released inside of this curled structure, which is called the keel, and the anthers and the style and stigma are all curled up inside of there. And so the pollen, if it's released, will fall onto the stigma and that pollination happens, and that's good. If the pollen is not released, then you get this sort of situation over here where you have the stigma with no pollen on it. And hot nights can also reduce, all right, there we go, pollen quality. So even if the pollen is released, it might not be very good, and it might not germinate or affect fertilization. So the results of all of that, when you have heat stress, is that you get plants with fewer seeds in each pod. That results in misshapen pods or short pods. If you get no fertilization at all, the pods might abort or just fall off. And this can delay harvest or cause split sets. In snap beans, you tend not to have quite so many split sets. You just have reduced yield, although it is possible to get split sets in snap beans. So I'm going to show you several different pictures of ways to get terrible yield in snap beans that are heat stressed. So here, this plant in the middle here is still flowering. It has set a pod or two, but they're very low quality. Here's another couple pods. So you can have continued flowering, which could result in split sets in this case. You can also basically end up with no pods. So these plants were all pulled well after they should have had mature pods on them. It was when we were harvesting all the other varieties. And so these small hook-shaped pods are probably just going to fall off and abort. You can see that this plant has one sort of mature pod, and that's a picture of basically no pods. And then here's a picture of plants that set quite a few pods, but they're all low quality pods with lots of missing seeds and distorted, unmarketable pod shapes. So there you're getting some yield, but it's not really marketable yield. So when I do these snap bean trials, it's important to evaluate the grades of the pods, so that, because some varieties will produce a fairly high number of pods, so you get a good yield, but not a good marketable yield. So these are all 300 gram samples of pods from these 4 varieties: PV857, Bridger, Caprice, and Affirmed. And those 300 gram samples were separated into fancy, number 1, and cull. So the fancy and number 1 categories are considered marketable, and the culls are obviously not marketable. PV857 and Bridger are 2 varieties that seem to have good heat tolerance. And you can see that they have larger quantities of pods in the 2 marketable categories, fancy and number 1, whereas Caprice and Affirmed, 2 varieties that are not very heat tolerant, have a majority of the yield ending up in the cull category. This chart is showing the results from the early trial in the orange bars and the late trial in the blue bars. So the orange and blue portions of the bars are the marketable yield, and the gray portion is the cull yield for each of these varieties. And the order that they're in here is in marketable yield in the early trial. So this order is from most heat tolerant to least heat tolerant in terms of marketable yield under heat stress. You can see that overall yields were much higher in the later unstressed trial for all of the varieties, and that the proportion of cull yield was lower in the late trial. So we're going to look at that chart again in more detail, but heat tolerant varieties from this year and past years that have been identified are PV857 from Kreitz Seed, and that has been trialed for 3 years and looked heat tolerant in all of those trials. Annihilator from Pure Line Seeds was in the 2018 trial and showed evidence of being heat tolerant, as well as Dominator was in the 2018 trial and was heat tolerant. Bridger was in this year and looked quite heat tolerant. In 2019, I trialed flat potted varieties, and Usambara from Seminis was the only flat potted variety that had a good yield in the stressed trial. And it also had the highest yield in the unstressed trial. So that just seems to be a pretty good variety overall. So here's this chart again. The varieties that have red boxes around them are ones, the 10 varieties with the highest yields, highest marketable yields in the unstressed trial. So yield wise, under no stress, these are the varieties that look the best, that were not statistically significantly different in terms of yield from one another. These are just pictures of the pods that were in that group, those 10 varieties, and they are arranged by pod grade, size grade. So BEX 175 is a flat potted variety. And so there were 2 flat potted varieties in the trial, and this numbered line from Brotherton was higher than the standard variety that they sent, which was Saya. Then the rest of these are in order from smallest grade to largest grade. SVGG 2106 was 80% 3-sieve and 15% 4-sieve beans. That's what these numbers underneath mean. PV 946 was the yellow bean that was in the trial. It had absolutely horrific yields under heat stress, but yielded really well in the unstressed trial and produced lots of really beautiful beans. Silverado was the highest yielding variety in the unstressed trial. So, and both Silverado and PV 946 are mostly 3-sieve varieties, so definitely smaller. Unfortunately, if what you want is 3-sieve bean, the 2 varieties that have looked best as far as heat tolerance, PV 857 and Bridger in the trial this year, are more on the 4-sieve side of things, and Bridger had a fair percentage of 5-sieve beans. So it was the largest variety in the trial. Okay, so moving on to the P trials. The early trial was planted on March 16th, which was the day before we got completely shut down. Just to mention for some context for this trial, we had some emergence problems because we were using a different drill that we don't usually use when we planted this trial, and we had some depth control problems that resulted in poor emergence. So I would say take these yield results with a grain of salt. So I wouldn't discount things that looked bad in this trial. They may have gotten unlucky, but things that looked good, I would say they were good. So CS 455 AF was a variety that was also in the 2018 trial and also looked good in that trial. PL 11 P42, so this is a pure line variety, was in the 2016, 2018, and then this year's trial, and looked good in all 3 of those trials. And let's see, SV 741, whatever it is, SV 7401 QH is a small sieve variety. It was also in the 2018 trial and looked good in that trial. This is the only small sieve variety that I've really ever had in my trials that looked half decent. I've had a couple over the years. I guess if you're interested in small sieve peas, this would be one to try. So there are a couple varieties there that have been multiple years that looked good again this year. It'd be interesting to see what these Brotherton, the BSC varieties look like in future years. And then the late trial was planted April 17th. We got the drill issues figured out on this one. So our planting depth problem solved, and emergence was a lot better. BSC 7120 was a variety that was in the 2018 trial. It looked good in the 2018 trial. It's being used commercially in this area, so it was included as a standard this year, indicated by the red marker here. I'm not sure what Brotherton entered as BSC 712 looked very similar. So not sure if they just took the 0 off there. I did check my notes again to make sure I didn't take the 0 off, but maybe those two are related. And then these other varieties that I've indicated are varieties that have been in the 2018 trial and looked good in that trial and also looked good this year. So Dancer, 2 of the Seminis SV varieties with the high quality traits, and BSCP 070 from Brotherton. Okay, and now I just want to share a few thoughts about lima bean trials. So this chart is showing yield on the vertical axis and days to harvest on the horizontal axis, like the previous charts I was showing you for peas, which I forgot to explain there. So hopefully you figured out what was going on in those charts. Okay, so maturity along the bottom, the earliest ones are over here to the left, latest ones to the right, and lowest yielding at the bottom, highest yielding at the top. This trial was planted June 9th, the same day as the heat stressed snap bean trial. So these lima beans were exposed to a lot of heat stress during flowering as well, just like the snap beans, and same sort of issues going on. So I want to point out just a few interesting lines here. DE 1304-605F. This one matured super early, 63 days after planting. It's green seeded and it's F resistant to race F of downy mildew. So this is a variety or a line that I'm interested in working with more to see if it looks good in future years. This was the first year that it was in the advanced trial, so it came out of the first year trial last year. So one to watch, there were several lines. Cypress is indicated by this red dot, so there's a cluster of red markers here that are Meadow G 2003-82, which is the new line from ADM, and Cypress. The other standards, C Elite Select and 184-85 are over to the right, indicated by the red dots. So those are the standard varieties. You can see that there were several lines that came off earlier than the early ADM material, and several of them were quite a bit earlier. So I have been selecting for earliness. Looks like I have effectively been selecting for earliness. Another line that was interesting was DE 1305-306, which is early, same maturity as Cypress, but much higher yielding. This is a heat tolerant line. Unfortunately, the seed is not really green enough to be commercially acceptable. So obviously I'm making a lot of crosses with that one. And then this one, DE 1306-583, was an early variety that is root knot nematode resistant and green seeded. I'm hoping to yield trial some of the root knot resistant lines in an inoculated field, so to see what they look like under root knot pressure yield-wise compared to Cypress. Hoping to do that in 2021 in collaboration with Alyssa Kaler. We'll see. I have a batch of lines that will be ready for field trials next year that have been greenhouse screened for heat tolerance and root knot nematode, and many of those are green seeded. It's a large number of lines, probably 60 lines. So hopefully out of that material, I'll be able to identify some things that are heat tolerant, green seeded, and root knot nematode resistant, which would be really lovely. And this chart is showing days to harvest and yield for the first year trial. So this is material that I'm looking at for the very first time in a yield trial. Things that I have selected based on greenhouse screening or in-field assessments. So again, here the red dot here, this is Cypress, number 33, the first red dot to the left, and the C Elite Select 36, the far right red dot, the two standards that are in the trial. And you see Cypress did a lot better in this trial than it did under the heat stress trial. And overall yields were much higher in this trial, which was exposed to less heat stress with the later June planting. So in this batch of lines that I'm looking at yield for the first time, there are many early green seeded lines, some of which were earlier than Cypress. The yields look a little bit lower on these, but I think that might have been exacerbated by the fact that some of them got harvested a little late because I was consumed by trying to pick all those snap beans, which were coming off at the same time. There are quite a few lines in here that are potential root knot nematode resistant, hoping to get them field screened next year. And the white boxes are indicating lines that have good upright architecture. So many of the lines are in that category. So lots of interesting things to look at in more detail next year in the advanced trial that are coming out of this one. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that I have used this 1, 2, 3 rating scale for rating of pollen release under heat stress. And I managed to get that done on July 23rd for about 40 flowers out of each of these lines that are listed here, which included all the standard varieties in the advanced trial. And it confirms some things that I had known or suspected from greenhouse studies, that Elite Select is slightly less heat tolerant than Cypress. Cypress is still not heat tolerant, but had a lower pollen, Elite had a lower pollen rating than Cypress. And there were several lines here that are breeding lines suspected of being heat tolerant that had good pollen ratings. And that's somewhat correlated with yield. Certainly for the top 3, there's a yield correlation there. DE 13-060-01A, the one in the middle that didn't have all that great of a pollen rating, but had a very high yield. It had a very late yield, so it's possible that that was the result of delayed pod set. So that variety might not actually be all that heat tolerant. And the same thing with Elite Select and 18485, which had higher yields than Cypress and Meadow, even though they had lower pollen ratings. As you know, those varieties are much later, and yield tends to be pushed back more for them by heat stress.